Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. This is Brian. It's been another beautiful day outside. I want to take just a few minutes and share with you about how God provides for us. If you look in Genesis chapter 22, you see another name of God in the Old Testament uh, where Abraham calls him that our God will provide, that God will provide. Jehovah Jireh, or Jehovah, sometimes Jireh is how it's pronounced. Now, I will make a distinction as I go through, or make a deliberate choice, rather, as I go through these Old Testament names of God, to use the name Jehovah. Now, Jehovah is somewhat of a made up name, but I use it to avoid a little bit of confusion and at the same time to honor I guess, a more traditional practice when it comes to Hebrew. When you go through the Old Testament, the divine name, what most scholars would pronounce as Yahweh today. Traditionally, that divine name was not pronounced, and scribes after 70 AD, instead of pronouncing the divine name, they would swap out the word Adonai, which means my Lord. And so when you go in your English Bibles, you'll see that wherever the divine name is written, it's written in most English Bibles as capital LORD. And it reflects this tradition of not using the divine name and instead inserting Adonai, or my Lord. Well, the Hebrew, the divine name, it has four consonants: Yod He Vav He. And the scribes, instead of, like I said, instead of pronouncing the divine name, they would pronounce it Adonai. Well, one of the ways that they preserved that practice was they had a distinction between what was written and what is read. And so one pattern that you see throughout the Hebrew Bible is wherever the divine name is, they have written the vowels underneath those consonants. They've written the vowels for Adonai. And the understanding is when you see the word, you would say Adonai instead of Yahweh, or however the word is pronounced. And there is some debate about that because if you look at what's actually written, how they have put in the vowels, it's really quite unpronounceable. But later on, in the 1600s, when the Hebrew Bible was transliterated into English, for example, the consonants were written with the Adonai vowels. And so you come up with a word like Jehovah. And so that's I guess, the traditional, it's really a blended approach between the consonants that are actually in the Hebrew Bible and the vowel pattern of Adonai. Now, that may have confused you. If it does, just throw it out. Don't worry about it. I choose to use Jehovah just so that you understand that I understand that what is written is the divine name. But at the same time, I use Jehovah instead of Adonai because I think that would be a little bit more confusing for everyone. So I will use Jehovah. But in Genesis chapter 22, you see this declaration that God will provide, Jehovah Jireh. And it's in the middle of this really strange story in the life of Abraham. Toward the end of his life, Abraham is an old man now. He's probably 115 or so years old. Isaac is at least a teenager. He's a strong enough young man that he can tote wood, as you'll see in the story. And I'll begin in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1. And the Bible tells us, verse 1, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Now, Abraham here receives, I would think, what would be pretty difficult instructions. And although the Bible doesn't tell us that Abraham stayed up all night and agonized about what needed to happen, it's hard to understand a father taking any child with the knowledge that he was going to sacrifice that child on an altar. The Bible says that this took place after these things. Now, this is after the, of course, miraculous intervention of God and the provision of a son in late life to very old parents who are beyond the age of having children. It says that after these things, he was told to take his son, his only son. And I think it's very fair to notice some parallels at this point between Abraham and God. One, they are both fathers. Abraham is to take his son, his only son. And when we look in the New Testament, we see Jesus as the unique son, the only son of God. Abraham is to take his son and offer him as a sacrifice. And if you look in the New Testament, God does exactly the same thing, where he sends his son Jesus as a sacrifice. He tells Abraham to go on one of the mountains of Moriah. And while we don't know exactly where this is, it is somewhere in the region of Jerusalem. In fact, some scholars have taken some time to build a case that the site of Abraham's offering of Isaac is Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified. And that may or may not be the case. Abraham here is instructed to offer Isaac as a burnt offering, or as a whole burnt offering. Now, according to Leviticus, there are two requirements for a whole burnt offering. One, the offering must be offered freely. It must be offered voluntarily, knowing full well that the offering will be completely lost is in the nature of this. Abraham knew exactly what God was asking him to do when he asked him to offer Isaac as a whole burnt offering. The second thing about a burnt offering was the offering had to be given completely. That for whole burnt offerings, they were whole. There was no part of the animal, there was no part of the sacrifice that could be held back. And of course, with the giving of human life, there was nothing really that could be held back. Abraham was called upon to offer to God everything that he had. And so you look in verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Now, I can't imagine, as a father, what great difficulty or what travail must have been in his spirit as he did all of these things. And yet, Abraham deliberately obeys God. He takes some time to think through the provisions that he will need for the journey. And so he gets up early, he makes preparation, he brings 2 men with him, he cuts the wood for the offering. Later we'll see that he puts that upon Isaac, and Isaac carries the wood for the offering. And there is some thought given for this journey. Preparation is made. And I think in our own lives, we must make preparation as we obey God. If you look in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 11 gives a little bit of commentary on this particular scene in Abraham's life. The writer of Hebrews in verse 17 of chapter 11 says this: "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." You know, I think Abraham really had to wrestle with this, but based on the New Testament writer here, there was some point where Abraham came to the decision that God knew what he was doing, and that God would somehow provide for all the needs and provide for this promise that he had made to him way back in chapter 12 in some way, shape, or form, even if that meant raising Isaac from the dead. In other words, Abraham didn't set out on his journey kind of going through the motions with the idea that he was going to draw back at the last minute. No, Abraham knew full well the journey that he was about to undertake, and that as he walked up with his son Isaac and those 2 young men that were with them and the donkey, that he really fully expected to offer his son Isaac, and that he was prepared to go through the whole ordeal. They get to the place along the mountain, this specific place that God had designated for him to go. And there he builds an altar. He sets up the wood that they had prepared, and he fashions it in such a way to have this burnt offering. At some point, he binds Isaac and puts him on the altar. You know, Isaac had to be a willing accomplice in this. Isaac was a strong young man. Abraham was well advanced in years. Again, I mentioned that Isaac was the one who carries the wood on his shoulders up the mountain. It wasn't Abraham that did this. I have to think perhaps along the journey that Abraham told Isaac what was about to transpire, and that Isaac was in some way complicit, that Isaac either understood the word of the Lord, or Isaac trusted in his father Abraham to the extent that he allowed himself to be bound and laid on this altar. If you look down in verse 10, the scripture says that then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. Now, Abraham had done everything that God had asked him to do. And we see this scene on the mountain where Abraham has the knife in hand, drawn back to take the life of his son. He's done everything that God has told him to do up until this point. And then you see in verse 11 some intervention. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. God says, now I know. Now, God knew exactly what Abraham would do. He knew that Abraham would complete this test. But we see that Abraham's faith was tested, that it was made complete. Not only did God know, but Abraham knew at this point that he was completely in obedience to his God. You see here this strange picture of an angel. Now, this isn't the first time you see the angel of the Lord. Some people make a distinction between the angel of the Lord and God himself. I think you will find that the Bible is quite strange and that the biblical narrative doesn't really make a distinction between the two, that the angel is a visible embodiment of God himself. There's two clues in this passage that really point in this direction. One, when the angel of the Lord cries out to Abraham, Abraham recognizes the voice. Now, back in verse 1, Abraham is given instructions directly from God. Now, that may be the angel speaking. We're not told that, or that may be directly from God. Here in verse 11, you see the angel crying out to Abraham, and Abraham recognizes the voice. So he's not startled. He's not surprised. It's not some new entity that Abraham is here being introduced to. And then if you look at the instructions in verse 12, the angel of the Lord says, Do not lay your hand on the board or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God. There seems to be a distinction at this point between the angel of the Lord and God. But look at what happens next. Now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me, the angel says. So we see a complete identification between God and the angel of the Lord. Well, thank goodness that there is some intervention. You know, sometimes we go on life's journey, and as believers, we follow the instructions of God. And sometimes we wonder exactly what we will get up to along the way. Sometimes the instructions of God are not easy. And sometimes doing the right thing, a lot of times doing the right thing, is not the easy thing to do. And it's oftentimes much easier to do just about anything else than what we absolutely know is the will of the Lord in our life. Do we trust God when we are on the journey? Now, Abraham was going along, and he had no idea what was going to happen, and yet he walked in obedience. As we follow God, sometimes we go along in our lives, and we have no idea how things are going to work out, and yet we're called upon to walk in obedience. Can we trust God in these circumstances? Can we trust God when we're not quite sure what is about to happen? Well, I can find a lot of parallels with the situation that we're in right now with this pandemic. No one knows exactly how this thing is going to turn out. We have models and we have conflicting models. We have opinions and we have differences of opinion. But as we're walking this out, how can we live as godly people, not knowing what is about to unfold. In other words, can we trust God to provide? Can we be faithful in our giving? Can we be faithful in our service? Can we be faithful in our integrity when we don't know what is about to happen? Can we trust Him when the job market looks rough? Can we trust Him when our security and our financial stability are called into question? Can we trust Him when we know the right thing to do, and yet friends and voices around us have a difference of opinion? Can we trust Him to provide for our health? Can we trust Him to provide healing? Can we trust Him to provide any need that we may have? Can we trust Him to give us wisdom as we decide to do what's next? Abraham goes up and he is willing to do everything that God has asked him to do at great peril and at tremendous cost, and absolutely willing to fulfill the whole deal. And yet he, and in the last moment, the angel of the Lord calls to him and tells him to hold his hand. Verse 12, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. Now, I know that had to be quite a dramatic moment while he has knife in hand. The very knife that he's willing to plunge into his son is the knife that he uses to cut the ropes that have him bound. Verse 13, and Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham had done his best to be prepared for this journey. He had carried the wood, he had carried the knife, he had carried the fire in order to offer this sacrifice. What he had was his son to sacrifice, and in the last moment, God provided a ram. But I don't believe that ram just miraculously appeared. I don't believe that ram just showed up suddenly, that it materialized in the bushes. No, God knew from the very beginning of this whole episode what he was about to do. And this ram God had provided even before Abraham set out on his journey. That the ram was making its way to this particular point at this particular place and time in order for Abraham to lift up his eyes and see it there. That God had provided the ram long before Abraham knew that God had provided a ram. And it says here that when Abraham lifted up his eyes, he noticed the ram. And that's just like our God. I know sometimes in my life where I've really not known how things were going to work out. I've really not known where provision was going to come from, but yet had some idea of the direction in which I needed to go. How God again and again has provided, has come through in what, in my perspective, was the last minute, but in reality is something that God had been working on for quite some time. And in your life, God will do the same thing. That if you trust that God is the provider, if you believe in him, if you follow his direction, if you follow his guidance. We talked last week about guidance. But if you follow his guidance, we can have confidence that God is able to meet the needs that we have. Maybe not every want that we have, not every whim, not every desire, but God is able to meet certainly our needs. And he does so again and again and again. And what we're called upon is to lift up our eyes and look. Abraham in verse 14 says that Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. Jehovah Jireh. Jireh is a form of the word ra'ah, which means to see or to look or provide. The idea is that God sees everything that you and I need, that he sees the whole world at one time, and that God is able to provide for our very specific need at just the right time and in just the right way and at just the right place, that our God can be trusted to provide for us. Abraham recognizes this, and he calls the name of the place, God will provide. The Lord will provide. And the last part of that verse 14, as it is said today, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. God is more than able to look after you and I. He sees to our each and every need, and he can bring the ram to the right place at the right time. And as we're experiencing this crazy time that we're living in right now, I want to encourage you to, like Abraham, to lift up your eyes and look, to look for the provision of God. You don't have to understand it. You don't have to know where it's coming from, but look and expect that God will provide for his people. Abraham didn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out how that ram got there. He didn't spend a lot of time trying to figure out where it came from or why it got caught. No, he just recognized the ram as exactly what it was, the provision of the Lord.